Hey there. Welcome back to the quiet side of time. Tonight, we drift into a city not quite made of stone, but of mist, salt, and secret syllables. Venice, where love once traveled on folded parchment, tucked beneath the edge of a glove. There are wax seals cooling on hidden letters, and footsteps echoing over bridges no longer marked on any map. Dim the lights. Let your breath slow. Place your thoughts beside the pillow. And if soft stories like this help you rest, you can tap subscribe now, or maybe after the meow. I've saved something rare for the very end. Venice did not rise. It floated, not on power or stone or the spires of saints, but on wood sunken deep into lagoon silt, where the sea pressed against silence and silence pressed back. In the 16th century, the city was neither awake nor asleep. It breathed lightly, like a resting cat, curled between columns and clouds. Gondolas shifted in their moorings, sighing into the tide. Above them, windows flickered with amber light, or none at all. Beneath each window, there might have been a secret. A letter tied to a sill with red thread, a faint perfume in the air where no one walked, or two figures pausing just too long at the corner of a narrow calle where the walls nearly touched across the way. By day, Venice was velvet and law, sumptuary codes, long sleeves, powdered wigs, doges and documents, senators and saints. But by night it was paper and wax and the hush of things unsaid. The alleys twisted like memory, and sometimes the only guide was the slosh of water below, or the echo of a lute carried through fog. Lovers, forbidden or just careful, moved like shadows through the passageways. And because mouths were watched, they wrote. And because eyes were everywhere, they folded. And because trust was fragile, they sealed. Letters in Venice were not just notes. They were movements. They were risks, pressed in ink. One might be passed from a nobleman to his laundress, not in speech, but inside a hollow coin. Another, stitched into the hem of a servant's sleeve, or dropped behind a basket of figs, collected only when the bell at San Barnaba rang twice. Secrecy was a fabric the city wore easily, with its masks, its floating houses, its quiet glances through keyholes. It was a city that blurred. In the morning, mist crept across the canals like memory, softening the edges of basilicas and the stern mouths of stone lions. Even light felt hushed there, filtered, refracted, rarely direct, as if the city preferred to stay in twilight. Its bridges rose like bones across the water, arch after arch, silent as breath. Some bridges had no parapets, just smooth stone, worn by centuries of steps. There, in winter, lovers sometimes passed without speaking. A brush of fingers was enough. In one courtyard, quiet now but not abandoned, pigeons once watched a ritual unfold. A man knelt to press a letter into the gap beneath a painted door. He would never see the reply, only smell it days later. Cypress oil, dried lavender, and ink the color of garnets. To the north, near the Church of the Miracoli, a woman stood at her window each evening at the hour of first stars. She held no candle, but the glint in her hair served just as well. Some said she was a widow, others said she was a spy. The truth, folded into a wax-sealed page, slept somewhere in the archives of the state. And always, there were boats. Flat-bottomed, long-throated, black like beetles. They glided soundlessly past stone and iron. Some carried fish, some velvet, some nothing but a folded paper beneath the seat, waiting to be handed off at a place where one canal met another. The city was never still, even when it seemed to be. Curtains stirred where no wind blew. Shadows moved a second too late. A footstep rang out, then stopped, not for fear, but for timing. In those years, lovers did not speak freely. They crafted moments like puzzles, one gesture in public, one in private, a glance held for just a breath longer than polite. And when they wrote, they did not sign. Names were dangerous. Instead, there were symbols: a moth drawn in graphite, a single pressed rose petal, a Latin verse missing its ending. Ink was an intimacy. It carried the weight of touch without skin, and the paper, often handmade, carried more than words. It held scent, smudges, sometimes tears. These were not just letters. They were breath caught on page. Every palace had its secrets. Every bridge had its ghosts. And every canal, no matter how narrow, had carried a folded message at least once, sometimes tossed from boat to boat, sometimes lost in the water, sometimes never meant to be delivered at all. But even unread, the letter existed, and in a city like Venice, that was enough. For as long as it floated, as long as fog wrapped the lanterns, there would be hands to write and hands to receive. There would be wax and breath and waiting. And somewhere, in a room just a little too quiet, a seal was cooling beside a name never spoken aloud. But the letter was only the beginning. Before it could be read, it had to be folded, and folded not once, but just so. Long before the envelope, there was only the fold, not a random crease, but a method, a message, a ritual shaped by paper, privacy, and time. In 16th century Venice, a letter was not sealed in haste. It was shaped, sculpted, pressed and pleated like cloth meant for a sacred body. It carried not just words, but the sound of hands folding slowly in silence. There were dozens of known methods, passed down not through schools or scrolls, but through memory and imitation. Each one had meaning. Each one said something without ink. The triangle tuck, for instance, used often by merchants or by lovers who wished to hint but not confess. The double pleat spiral, favored by lawyers, full of cautious energy. And the square lock fold, so complex, it required a tiny slit to close itself, making any tampering visibly violent. In the candlelit study of a merchant's wife, we pause gently. The shutters are closed, the hour late. Her breath slows as she finishes her letter, a string of careful Italian syllables addressed not to her husband, but to the son of a silk dyer in Dorsoduro. Her pen scratches the final words. She does not sign. She never signs. Instead, she lifts the paper, still damp at its edges, and waits. A moment passes, enough time for the ink to settle and the air to cool around the truth. Then she begins to fold, one corner over another, then the bottom edge tucked in like a blanket, a diagonal crease, sharp as glass, and a final turn that hides the text completely, like the closing of a book with no title. Each fold is a gesture of privacy, each crease a breath not taken. Folding was not just practical, it was symbolic. To fold a letter was to transform it, from voice to artifact, from emotion to code. It was a paper ritual, and the ritual changed with the sender. A noblewoman might fold her note in 6 equal parts, tight as a ribbon on a corset. A gondolier, hurrying before first bell, might simply roll the page like a scroll and tie it with a twist of thread from his sleeve. Some folds were regional, others seasonal. In Lent, letters were sometimes folded in the shape of a cross. In summer, when the air was thick with heat and rumor, a looser fold allowed for quick opening and quicker burning. Scholars have traced these folding styles in archives, noting their names like forgotten dances, the dagger fold, the fishtail, the cathedral crease. each one unique in the way it carried and concealed desire. Seals came later, but the fold came first. It was the skin around the heart of the letter. It determined how easily it could be broken and how long it might survive a curious hand. In the Scuola dei Carmini, a young scribe once folded letters in the shape of lilies. He never wrote them himself, only copied them, word for word, from the whispered dictations of his patrons. He never read them, but he knew their weight, knew which ones trembled as he folded, knew which ones smelled faintly of rosewater, or wine, or regret. And he knew, too, that some letters were folded not to be read, but to be held. A letter to a dying father, folded 7 times. A letter from a widow to a man she would never meet, creased into a near-perfect square and buried beneath a garden wall. Some letters were folded for the pleasure of secrecy alone, to hide a smile, a fear, a sentence too bold for daylight. And once folded, they changed. The letter no longer looked like language. It became an object, a private artifact, a sealed hush. Even now, centuries later, archivists in white gloves turn these missives in silence. They open the fold slowly, as if the paper might still breathe, as if the ink might whisper if startled. Some folds still bear the pressure of fingers, the ghost of a thumbnail pressed too hard, a smudge where a hand hesitated, a tiny indentation where a ring once rested while sealing. We can never know all that was written, but we can know how it was folded, and sometimes that is enough. In a city of masks and murmur, the fold was the final veil. Before ink was seen, the paper had already spoken, not loudly, but softly, like prayer. But even the most perfect fold needed more, a seal, warm and waiting. And that is where the next secret began. There was always a moment, after the folding, before the delivery, when the letter waited, unfinished. It was whole in shape, but not yet closed, like a secret with lips parted, not yet hushed. And into that stillness came the wax, a small spoon of brass or bone, its handle blackened from years of gentle fire. In its bowl, a pinch of red, or ochre, or soft blue. Wax made from resin and bees, sometimes mixed with ash or powdered silk, depending on who it was for, and whether it was meant to be read or burned. There were no envelopes in 16th century Venice, no factory-stamped flaps or glue. The seal was the lock, and like any lock, it held a key, not made of metal, but of symbol. As the wax softened over flame, it thickened slightly, like breath caught in the throat, then poured in a careful pool onto the last fold of the letter, still hot, still pulsing, and into that warmth, the seal, a ring, a stamp, a carved coin, pressed with quiet certainty. Some bore crests, lions with crowns, olive branches, helmets wreathed in ribbon. Others, initials entwined, letters curling together like lovers in sleep. A few, especially among the courtesans and poets, used sigils known only to their circle: a moon with 3 dots, a mirror, a palm with a single eye at its center. Each emblem whispered something: authority, intimacy, danger. It told the reader who had written the letter, or who had touched it last. In the archives of the Venetian state, some seals remain intact, cracked but not shattered. Waxy relics still clinging to the parchment they once guarded. The red ones were most common. Made from shellac and cinnabar, they looked like dried blood by candlelight. Green seals were rarer, used in legal matters, or when envy lingered in the air. Black wax meant mourning. Gold, reserved for those few whose voices carried past borders, and white, almost never seen, was used only for the purest vows or the most impossible lies. Sometimes the wax itself carried perfume, infused with myrrh or crushed cloves. To receive such a letter was to inhale memory. To break it was an act both reverent and irreversible. The breaking of a seal made a sound, a soft snap, like dry twigs beneath velvet, like trust being tested. Many seals were designed to crack, but some were meant to be peeled, lifted with a warm blade and reapplied, a skill mastered by spies, jealous lovers, and state censors. In Venice, no seal was truly safe. The Council of 10 employed specialists, men who could unseal a letter, copy its contents, and reseal it without a wrinkle. Their work was silent, invisible, and often fatal for those whose wax betrayed too much. Still, people sealed their letters, and still, the wax hardened, because even the illusion of privacy was better than none. Even the hope of secrecy was a kind of comfort. In the quiet of an apothecary's shop near Campo San Polo, a woman once carved seals from amber, not for nobles, but for women who had no crests, no formal names. She offered symbols instead: a fern for healing, a moth for quiet passion, a window left open. Her wax was softer than most. It never sealed completely, but the women who used it didn't mind. Sometimes, even paper deserves to breathe. Elsewhere in the city, wealthy families kept wax warmers on their desks, shaped like lions or saints, with small wicks that burned for hours. Children were taught to seal letters before they learned to read them. One press, one pause, one breath. Even illiterate hands knew how to hold the ring steady, how to let the wax wait just long enough, how to press, but not too deep. A too deep seal meant desperation. A shallow one meant fear. The best seals were quiet in the paper, present but not shouting. Some were sealed with borrowed symbols, a lover's ring taken without asking, a merchant's stamp used in jest, a bishop's seal copied by moonlight. Forgery was a serious crime, but in matters of love, it was sometimes forgiven, if the seal arrived unbroken and the letter did not lie. Wax was a pause between worlds, between the act of writing and the act of being read, between vulnerability and control. And when it cooled, it did not forget. In the archives, the wax still bears fingerprints, swirls of touch, small ridges where a ring once pressed too hard, even a hair, once, caught in the seal, embedded forever. No one knows whose hair it was, but it remains there, centuries later, a quiet relic of someone who once cared enough to press, and press slowly. Today, most people do not seal letters, but in Venice, the memory lingers, a waxy breath in the stone, a silence that still waits to be broken, because every seal once held a secret, and every secret once softened in fire. But even the strongest seal meant little if the letter never reached the right hands. And so, the folded heart had to travel, often in gloved fingers that asked no questions. The city was quietest in the hour just before dawn, that soft pause when the bells had not yet rung and the pigeons had not yet begun their prayers. But in that hush, there were always footsteps, not hurried, not loud, just soft soles on ancient stone, a rhythm practiced by those who did not want to be heard. These were the velvet couriers, not velvet by fabric, but by manner, invisible, ordinary, worn into the city like the smell of damp brick. The Venetian postal system, such as it was, belonged more to rumor than regulation. There was no uniform, no official pouch, just hands, countless hands, moving folded messages from one breath to another. Anyone could be a courier, and almost no one admitted to being one. A laundress carrying a basket of shirts, beneath the linen, a note tied with faded ribbon. a boy selling walnuts, but the coin he passed to a nobleman was hollow and clicked faintly when shaken. A widow's maid who always paused at the fishmonger's stall, not for eels, but for the slip of parchment pressed between scales. Most couriers were paid in secrets, or favors, or not at all. They did it for loyalty, for danger, for the simple thrill of touching something meant for someone else, and some for love. There are records, faded, incomplete, of servants who vanished after one letter too many, of gondoliers whose routes changed after delivering a folded note to the wrong canal, of children found with paper in their shoes, unaware of the meaning, but trained to carry, never to ask. In Venice, to ask was often more dangerous than to deliver. The methods were as varied as the couriers themselves. Some letters were carried openly, disguised as bills or lists. Others were smuggled in hollowed-out fans or hidden in the seams of gloves. In one case, a message was stitched into the hem of a nun's cloak, not with ink, but with thread, each knot representing a syllable. Only the recipient could unpick it. Only he knew how to read what was sewn in silence. There was a woman, name forgotten, story half remembered, who walked the same route every Tuesday. She carried a rose, always red, and wore a shawl with one silver pin. No one stopped her. No one spoke to her. But behind her, doors opened. A young man with ink-stained hands would step out, retrieve the paper from beneath a bench plank, and return without ever looking at the rose. The woman never paused. Her role was only the walking, only the presence. That was enough. Even gondolas could serve as messengers. Flat-bottomed and near silent, they slipped through the city like thought. Sometimes the courier was the boatman, sometimes the boat itself. In the crevice between seat and hull, letters rested in waxed linen, immune to spray and suspicion. If intercepted, they might appear to be old receipts. But folded just so, they revealed lines of poetry, of confession, of warning. The most trusted couriers were not the swiftest, but the quietest. They knew when to look away, when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Their movements were choreographed not by law, but by trust. There was no central post, no return address, only a city, breathing through its people, each pulse carrying a message. In the shadow of the Rialto, letters passed hands in the act of buying figs. In the pews of San Zaccaria, notes were pressed between hymnals. And in the echoing halls of forgotten palazzos, children played games with rules no one remembered, except that one player always held something, folded in their palm. To trace these couriers now is nearly impossible. They left no signatures, no seals of their own. Just the occasional testimony, the smudge of wax on a servant's apron, a fingerprint too small to notice until centuries later. But they were there, as constant as the tide, as necessary as breath. Without them, the words would never have moved. Desire would have stayed folded. Warnings would have gone unheard, and history would have had fewer ghosts. Venice, for all its grandeur, relied on hands that history forgot, on the bent backs and quiet steps of those who knew how to carry secrets without ever holding them. They asked for nothing, not even remembrance. But now and then, on a winter morning, a letter is found, tucked in a crack beneath a floorboard, never opened, still folded, still sealed. And someone, long ago, walked carefully through the fog, just to place it there. But a folded letter means little in stillness, unless it is opened. And before that, it must be read, slowly, and without a name. Convents were meant to be quiet, places of stillness, of ritual, of retreat. Stone cloisters echoing with birdsong and bells, walls thick enough to mute desire, and rules etched deeper than any scripture. But silence does not mean absence, and behind those shutters there was ink and longing, folded neatly between the lines of psalms. In 16th century Venice, the city's many convents were not only sanctuaries for the devout, they were sanctuaries for daughters. Unmarried women of noble birth were often sent there, not always by choice. The dowry system, strained by wealth and politics, meant some daughters were too expensive to wed, and so they were given to God, in theory. In truth, many of these women were barely cloistered. They wrote letters, they received visitors, they owned violins. Some even wore pearls beneath their veils, and at night, when the city sighed into sleep, they sat with ink. In one such convent, Santa Maria della Vergine, a young woman named Isabetta held a quill like a lifeline. She was the third daughter of a merchant prince, too clever to be married off, too inconvenient to leave in the household. So they placed her behind stone. But stone did not stop her. Each evening, long after Compline, she unrolled her paper, smoothed its corners, and began to write. The quill moved with slow confidence, dipping and scratching beneath the rhythm of distant waves. She wrote to a man she had never truly touched, the son of a silk merchant whose voice she knew from 3 brief conversations and a dozen overheard sermons. Their letters had begun with poetry. She sent him a line from Ovid. He answered with Petrarch. Back and forth for weeks until the Latin faded and the longing sharpened. By the 3rd month, she no longer quoted others. She wrote only her own words, small, angled, deliberate. Ink like shadow. The sisters never asked what she was writing. They had their own pages, their own confidences. In convents across Venice, women composed everything from herbal recipes to political warnings. They copied books, painted icons, and preserved histories the outside world chose to forget. But some, like Isabetta, wrote only for one pair of eyes. Letters from convents followed their own pathways. Some were smuggled out in baskets of laundered cloth, others carried by visiting priests or choir boys. Sometimes they were left in the garden wall, beneath the carved figure of St. Lucy, whose eyes had once been torn out, but who still saw everything. The act of writing was quiet, but never small. It was rebellion under the veil. Ink was safer than voice. Paper, more loyal than memory. In her room, Isabetta's candle burned low. The wax pooled beside a seashell she used as a rest. She wrote slowly, pausing often, not to think, but to feel. Outside, the city breathed in tides. Inside, her thoughts found rhythm. I cannot say your name here, she wrote once, but I have said it in silence so many times. The walls now echo it without asking. Her letters were never signed. She folded them in the nun's fold, 2 creases vertical, 1 diagonal, a fold passed down from older sisters who no longer wrote but still remembered. The seal was simple. No crest, no family name, just a single petal pressed into warm wax from the garden's smallest rose. Sometimes her letters went unanswered. Days passed, then weeks. But still, she wrote. Not for reply, not for closure, but because the act itself gave shape to her stillness, a place to place her hands, a way to remain herself in a place designed to dissolve her. She was not alone. Other convents held other hands. Some wrote to lovers, others to sisters on the outside. One nun famously corresponded with a cartographer in Padua, sending him descriptions of cloud patterns above the lagoon. He published them under his name, never revealing their source. One letter, unsigned, unsealed, and never delivered, was found years later, hidden behind a loose brick in the sacristy wall. Its ink had faded, but the words were still legible. I chose silence, but my silence is made of sound. If you ever hear singing in your dreams, it is only me, writing again. These were not the words of saints. They were the words of women, breathing through ink. Some letters were burned before they could be sent. Some were buried beneath floor tiles. One was folded into the hem of a dying nun's habit, never opened, never found until the garment was archived centuries later. Today, those letters survive not as documents, but as memory, as atmosphere. The convent walls still hold their shadows. The stone seems to listen, as if waiting for the next line. Isabetta's fate is unknown. Her letters stop after a certain date. No record remains of marriage or death or escape. But one of her pages does survive, creased, faintly scented, bearing only 7 words. I remember how he looked in silence. But not all messages were written in words. Some were folded in cipher, coded into shape, and stitched with meaning no one could hear aloud. Long before envelopes, long before stamps or postman's boots, letters had bodies. They curled, they pressed against themselves. They folded not for convenience, but for secrecy. In Renaissance Venice, a letter was more than message. It was gesture, it was shape, it was language folded into itself, a kind of bodily script, read not just by eye, but by hand. This was letterlocking, a practice old as paper, older perhaps than love's discretion, a way to seal secrets without needing words. Each fold told a story, not just what was written inside, but how it was sent, who touched it, and whether it was meant to be opened by its recipient, or only understood in silence. Paper bent like a breath held too long. Corners folded in like hands in prayer. Edges tucked into themselves, creased with urgency or with care. There were many kinds. The spiral lock, used by noblewomen, folded like a rosebud, sealed with wax so delicately placed, you'd need a blade to open it, or the sender's trust. The dagger fold, favored by soldiers and spies, pierced the paper through itself. A single slit, tightly looped, impossible to undo without scarring the message beneath. And then, there was the kiss. Fold. Soft. Simple. 2 corners drawn together like lips, sealed with a thumbprint, sometimes scented with crushed violets or ambergris. In Venice, folded letters passed beneath gloves, between books, inside hollowed combs. Couriers weren't always needed. A sleeve might do. A glance across a bridge. A servant with silent instructions. Paper carried breath. It held the scent of hands, of rooms long since quieted. Some lovers folded their letters to mimic the folds of fabric, imitating the bend of a bodice or the edge of a collar last seen in candlelight. There were folds that meant come, folds that meant never again, and folds that meant I dreamed of your breath in my sleep. One Venetian archivist, writing years later, recorded a strange cache of folded letters found behind a wooden crucifix in a canal-side chapel. Each was blank, no words inside, only shape. Some had been pierced with a pin, others sealed with red wax, then black wax, then no wax at all. No names, no dates, only evidence of something passed between lives. Among the folded languages of Venice, there were rules known only to a few. How many creases meant secrecy? Which angle of wax implied sorrow? Which edge, left unfurled, meant this was never meant to reach you? It was said that courtesans, those poised ghosts of the Venetian underworld, were trained in the folds, not just of fans and silks, but of paper. Some used it to trap admirers, others to hide truths in plain sight. there's record of a woman named Livia, who once folded a blank page into the shape of a mourning dove's wing. It carried no writing, only a scent, iris, and ink. The man who received it is said to have wept. To unfold one of these messages was to perform an intimate act. It required care. It risked destruction. Each seal, once broken, could not be replaced. That was the power of it. Not just secrecy, but finality. A Venetian senator once kept a letter from his mistress for over 30 years, unopened, locked in a lacquered box. He died with the seal still unbroken. To open it, he said, would end the mystery. And some mysteries were more alive than the truth. Historians today study these folds like ancient origami, each crease a decision, each tuck a whisper. They've mapped over 100 styles of lock, many now extinct, their meanings forgotten. But some survive. A letter recovered from a nun's cell, creased in a shape once used by Florentine midwives, still bears the faint print of someone's thumb. No writing inside, only one pressed word in wax, perduta, lost. Folded letters did more than preserve secrets. They preserved presence, a kind of paper body, creased where fingers lingered, creased again where doubt returned. Some sent these letters never expecting reply. The folding was enough. The ritual, its own reply. Others folded pages for the sake of art. They mimicked cathedrals, spiraled into flowers, or formed geometric locks that could only be opened by reversing the hand that made them. There was a kind of faith in that, a belief that the person unfolding would understand. But not all letters reached their hands. Some drifted in canals, some burned, some were hidden so well they were never found. One was buried in the base of a statue, a message never meant to be opened, just held in place like breath beneath marble. And now, centuries later, we study these folds like archaeologists of emotion, tracing sorrow with gloved hands, reading silence creased in paper older than memory. Ink fades, but a fold remembers. The wax may crumble, but the shape remains. And in the hush that followed each unfolding, something else began. The whispered customs of the masked and the watched. In the hour before dusk, Venice shimmered like breath on glass. Shadows lengthened down narrow corridors, and the canals darkened to velvet. Somewhere, a door clicked shut, and a face disappeared. Not into the crowd, but into the mask. This was not the carnival, not the loud parade with its dancers and drum beats. This was something softer, stranger, a midnight ritual of masks worn when no one asked why. By the 16th century, the mask had become a language in Venice, one spoken without words, with silk and feathers and the scent of face powder. To wear a mask was not simply to hide, it was to change shape, to erase class, gender, history, to be known by only your silence and what you dared to do once no one knew your name. There were rules, of course, and where there were rules, there were always exceptions. By law, masks were only allowed from Santo Stefano in December to the end of Carnival in February. But the night didn't care for laws, neither did love, or secrecy, or shame. And so, in the quieter parts of the city, masks appeared outside their season. They fluttered across bridges. They passed through garden gates. They whispered through confessionals and leaned into shadows as gondolas slid like ink down the canals. The most common was the bauda, a white, angular mask that covered the face without muffling the mouth. It allowed speech and wine and kisses without removal. Men and women wore it alike, and beneath it, no one knew if the person beside them was a prince, a beggar, a widow, or their own cousin. Then there was the Moretta, a black velvet oval worn by women, held in place by a small button clenched between the teeth. Silent by design, mysterious by necessity. A mask that could not speak even if it wanted to. It was said a biretta worn after sundown was not a sign of mourning, but of invitation. At dusk, masked figures drifted through narrow walkways, pausing beside wells, exchanging glances that meant everything and nothing. In one forgotten square, it was common to see a masked woman leave a folded paper on the rim of the cistern, gone before the bells struck the hour. No one ever saw who retrieved it. But the papers vanished, every time. Elsewhere, wealthy men donned masks not for pleasure, but protection. From scandal, from law, from themselves. They slipped into gambling halls lit with candle sweat, where fortunes changed hands between one breath and the next. Masks allowed what daylight denied. Priests wore them, merchants, servants, even nuns, once a year on the feast of Santa Maria Maddalena, were said to walk the outer gardens in white masks and veils, exchanging no words, only glances. Not all masks were romantic. Some concealed deals, spies meeting in taverns to sell secrets from Florence or Istanbul. One mask found in a cellar bore a hidden hinge, its velvet covering laced with powdered resin that would make its wearer faint if worn too long. Venetian masks were made from cartapesta, papier-mâché hardened by air and alchemy, delicate but resilient. They were painted by hand, often by blind artisans who claimed it kept the details purer. Some bore gold leaf, others were left plain, like blank stares on a crowded street. To wear one was to ask a question without needing an answer. A masked city became a city of suggestion, of half-spoken invitations, of paused footsteps, of letters delivered without names. One woman, known only as La Serpentina, never appeared without her mask, a long-nosed white piece like the plague doctor's beak, though hers was lined with perfume. She attended every masked opera for 20 years. No one knew her name, but everyone remembered her scent. She left no letters, only lace gloves and mystery. It was not uncommon for lovers to meet masked for months, never once revealing their faces. They kissed through fabric. They confessed in disguise. And when the time came to remove the veil, some never did. It was safer sometimes not to know. The anonymity of the mask offered more than freedom. It offered distance, detachment, a way to feel without being held responsible for the feeling. At midnight, the bells of San Moise echoed across the canal, and masked silhouettes slipped into gondolas that waited without asking. The gondoliers were paid not to see, not to wonder, not to remember. In some districts, masks were banned after a certain hour, and yet they always returned. They hung from balconies like forgotten fruit. They floated in the reflection of lanterns. They waited on windowsills, still as sleeping cats. When dawn approached, most were gone, hidden, tucked into drawers lined with lavender and coins. A face folded away like a letter never sent. But some remained, left on pews, on stairs, on benches at the edge of the sea. Abandoned masks were considered omens. Some said they were offerings. Others said they were confessions too soft to be spoken. Even now, a few remain in museums, worn smooth by unknown hands. They do not tell us who wore them, but they tell us someone once needed to disappear, just enough to be seen. And where one mask slipped away at dawn, another ritual quietly began, this time with perfume and a locked wooden drawer. By morning, the city returned to itself. Bridges stood bare, canals rippled softly under a paler sky, and behind shuttered windows, Tiny drawers clicked open with the delicacy of confession. In Venice, it was common to find a studiolo, a lover's cabinet, a scented drawer, a secret shelf inside a larger secret, hidden in carved wood, tucked behind paneling, or folded into the lining of a trunk. They were not locked with keys, but with custom, and the quiet knowledge that what was kept there was not meant to be seen by anyone but one. Inside, the objects were few but rich with meaning. A scrap of velvet from a stolen evening, a button, a piece of soap still clinging to a lover's skin, and most often, a vial. Small bottles, no longer than a thumb, some shaped like hearts, others like teardrops. They held perfume, but also memory. Scent was language, and language, in the right hands, could bruise or bless. Venetian perfumers were chemists of the unseen. They worked with oils, herbs, and things left unnamed. A pinch of civet from a caged cat, drops of rose oil soaked in goat's fat, ambergris scraped from the ocean's secret throat. And from these, they brewed desire, or at least, its illusion. A lover might send a handkerchief dusted with cloves and vetiver, or a glove softened in violet and neroli, or a comb laced with scent so faint it lingered only after hair had passed through. To inhale it was to remember, to be remembered. Some vials were exchanged in person, palmed discreetly in glove or purse. Others arrived anonymously, tucked inside hollowed books or beneath crusts of bread in market baskets. Each vial told a story. A perfume made of orris and bergamot was said to signal longing. Jasmine and sage, forgiveness, and musk was often left uncorked to speak for itself. But not every bottle held love. Some held warning. In certain households, a lover's studiolo contained more than memory. It held remedies against birth, against scandal, against waking up. Venice had its poisons, and some of them smelled like roses. The aqua tofana, a clear liquid born from arsenic, lead, and belladonna, could be hidden in a perfume flask. It was scentless, but not harmless. Stories whispered of noblewomen who used it to slip away from cruel husbands, or from love grown inconvenient. A few drops in a cordial, a kiss goodnight, and then silence. The makers of such liquids were rarely caught. They moved through apothecaries, in the shadows of spice merchants, or under the guise of midwives. One such woman, known only as La Fiamma, was said to craft perfumes so potent that to breathe them was to forget what one had meant to say. She made perfumes for memory and for erasure. It's unclear how many bottles she sold, but some believe her recipes remain, written in invisible ink between the lines of religious texts. Not all scents were fatal. Many were simply offerings, scent as promise, scent as apology, scent as surrender. Lovers who could not speak freely often communicated through their vials. A bottle left by the window meant, "I am thinking of you." One hidden inside a coat. "I was near." A cork left loosened. "I am no longer afraid." Some bottles were never opened, their meaning too sacred or too dangerous to release. One was found in a wall cavity during a renovation in the San Polo district. It was wrapped in silk. Inside, a single drop of amber oil and a ring still flecked with wax. No name, no note, only a time-smoothed mystery and a scent that lingered for days after the glass was cracked. Some studioli were destroyed after death, burned or buried with their keepers. Others survived, passed down as heirlooms, though no one ever said exactly what they were. It is said that if you visit the Museo di Palazzo Mocenigo and stand very still beneath the staircase, you can smell something faint, not from the perfume gallery, but from the wood itself. Cinnamon, lavender, perhaps a memory that refuses to leave. Back then, it was dangerous to love freely, but scent could pass through keyholes. It could slip beneath thresholds and hide behind the folds of a letter. And when the affair was over, the studiolo remained, half full, half haunted, a cabinet of breath and glass, a memory folded into wood. Most vials dried out with time. The oils faded. The perfume turned to dust. But sometimes, when the drawers are opened in silence, something lingers, something not yet named. Perhaps it is regret, perhaps devotion, perhaps just the trace of a hand that once reached for something forbidden. And before the final bottle could be sealed, the scent of salt drifted in from the window, and with it, the sound of paper unfolding. It was not the wind that betrayed the letter, nor the ink, nor the paper, nor the trembling hand. It was something softer, something in between time and chance, that made it disappear. In Venice, words had weight, but only if they arrived. Letters were the city's blood. They moved through alleys like breath, folded and refolded, kissed with wax, sealed with pressed coins or the soft stamp of a signet ring. Every bridge had seen them, slipped into coat linings, tucked into market baskets, hidden between pages of a prayer book. There was a system, but it changed with the moon. A woman might leave a letter beneath the steps of the Scuola Grande, tied with blue ribbon. If collected by noon, it meant yes. If left untouched by dusk, the answer was no, or worse, forgotten. Some letters were written in code, using perfumes or pressed petals or the deliberate absence of a date. Others were coated in milk or vinegar, revealing their message only under flame. But most were simpler. A few lines, a name unsaid, a place, a time, a plea. The letter that vanished was written on a night of fog, a night when the bells of San Marco could barely be heard and the moon hung low. A coin dropped into thick velvet. No one knows the name of the woman who wrote it, only that her hand shook as she wrote, and that her candle burned low, crackling softly as if trying to interrupt. She used a quill sharpened 3 times. The ink was brown, not black, cheap, and running out. Her message was short, no more than 6 lines. It was not poetic, but it was full of longing, of warning, of something she dared not say aloud. She folded it once, then again, then pressed a dried violet between the pages before sealing it with red wax. Not her own. The letter was meant for a man who never gave his name, only initials, and a meeting point, beneath the arch near the fish market, before the sun touched the water. But the letter never made it there. It passed through 4 hands: a baker's wife, a choir boy, a gondolier who owed a debt, and finally, a young girl with an apron still damp from soap. She was meant to place it in the stone hollow where the secret notes waited at dawn. Instead, she paused. Her fingers traced the seal. She sniffed the fold, violet and starch, and then she slipped it into her pocket, just for a moment. Some say it fell from her apron. Others say she read it, panicked, and dropped it in the canal. One version claims it was intercepted by a masked figure in blue who never spoke, but was known for collecting words he did not write. Whatever happened, the letter was gone by morning. The man waited beneath the arch. He leaned against the stone, boots soaked in fish water, watching every face as if waiting for one that might forgive him. He left before noon. No letter, no violet, no reply. The woman never wrote again. But the story of the letter traveled without it. Whispers moved faster than gondolas. It was said the letter contained a confession, a child, a crime, a plan to disappear. Others believed it was a goodbye, or a warning, or an invitation that came too late. The violet, too, became part of the story. Some said it was a funeral flower, others, a secret signal used only by those trained in the arts of love and treachery. Years later, a page surfaced, not the letter itself, but a journal entry from a midwife who remembered a girl with frightened eyes and red wax beneath her nails. But nothing more. The city forgot the names, but not the ache. For in Venice, the letters that were lost were never truly gone. They lived in drawers, in the folds of old garments, in the corners of attics where silverfish turned secrets to lace. Sometimes, an archivist would discover a note tucked between ledgers, never sent, never signed, and the ink would still stain his fingers. Sometimes a chimney sweep would find a bit of parchment half burnt, with words that blurred when touched. And sometimes, just before rain, a piece of paper would lift from the edge of a stone windowsill, dance once, and vanish. They said the city was built on water, but it was made of paper. Thin layers of feeling passed hand to hand, pressed with lips, or smeared with tears, or crumpled by second thoughts. And in the archives of silence, the vanished letter remained, a weightless ghost, unread, unanswered, but never unfelt. And just as the letter dissolved into mist, a drawer in another city opened, and a velvet ribbon fell to the floor. The candle had burned low, not in a cathedral, not in a palazzo, but in the quiet, unmarked corridor where time folds itself in half. The ink had long dried. The letters had been read, then hidden, then forgotten. And still, in some unlit drawer beneath the dust of 5 centuries, a seal of red wax remained, cracked but unbroken. This was not history, not anymore. It was what comes after, the slow unwinding of breath, the slumping of memory into soft oblivion. Somewhere, there had been a gondola rocking gently. Somewhere, a girl had tucked a message into her glove. Somewhere, a boy had kissed a letter before it left his fingers. But those gondolas were buried now beneath modern motors and algae. Those gloves had been stitched into silence by moths. And the boy's kiss, well, it evaporated, as all kisses must. What lingers in the end is not the message, not the words, not the paper or the pen, but the gesture, the leaning toward one another, across distance, across danger, the human impulse to write something down so it won't disappear, even though it always does. In the 16th century, Venice had 103 printing presses. Paper mills hummed in the northern hills. Clerks inked receipts. Poets inked heartbreak. But the most delicate words, the truly dangerous ones, were not printed. They were whispered, written crookedly, hidden behind portrait frames, stuffed in aprons, tucked beneath cathedral flagstones. A century passed, then another, and the canals forgot the names of those who had once confessed things over their waters. And yet, the air still holds shapes, the smell of warmed wax, the drag of a signet ring through a flame, the silence of a room just after someone has left it. And the wax in the end, forgot. It forgot who it had sealed for, forgot the fingers that pressed it, forgot the urgency, the pulse, the fevered wish to remain hidden or to be found. All that remained was a cool, rounded mark, a ridge of memory without a name. In the same way, old diaries begin to lose their voice, old poems lose their rhyme, old cities lose their edges and dissolve into mist. But still, a listener had come. Still, someone, perhaps tonight, had closed their eyes while drifting through this soft cathedral of stories. Not to learn, not to chase, but to be near. To be near the quiet that history leaves behind. The wax is cold now. The lovers are gone. Even the bridges have changed their stones. But some trace remains, not loud enough to teach, only soft enough to dream through. A woman waiting beside a canal, unsure if he will come. A man folding a letter slowly, as if by doing so, he can delay its ending. A child, watching their mother press a seal shut with trembling fingers. Nothing loud, nothing urgent, only quiet things, slowly receding. Venice sleeps now, and so does the parchment, and so does the breath that once carried a secret across the water. And somewhere, not far from where the last chapter ended, the next story has already begun to soften into silence. And somewhere in the dusk, a spoon clinks in a monastery kitchen. The hour of soup has arrived. And now, the wax has cooled. The names have faded, and the gondolas rock gently in a city half asleep. If this story helped soften your breath, I'm glad you wandered here tonight. There are more secrets, more shadows, more forgotten moments waiting in the quiet. If you'd like to drift with us again, you can tap subscribe or let the silence decide. For now, rest easy. Let the candle burn low. The ink is dry, the night is kind, and nothing more is asked of you. Sleep well, dream slow, and I'll see you in the next story.